If you think Joe Exotic is a hero and Carol Baskin is Cruella de Vil, listen up. The PETA lawyer in The Tiger King tells the truth about both from the animal's perspective. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. And today, let me share with you one of my COVID activities. I just finished a course and now I'm certified. Well, you always knew that, but no, certified in whole food, plant-based nutrition. Yeah, I'm a kind of a nutrition vegan coach now. Hey, but I can tell you probably consumed Tiger King on Netflix this COVID period, right? I mean, most of America did, nothing to be ashamed of, and they're still talking about it. I only watched it for the PETA parts, which means I saw PETA lawyer Brittany Peet, and on today's episode, Brittany talks about what got left out of the documentary, the truths about roadside zoos, how the FDA is actually an enabler of Joe Exotic's animal abuse, how Carol Baskin has done great work in trying to stop that abuse. Yeah, she's going to defend Carol Baskin. And how PETA was negotiating with Joe Exotic prior to the murder for hire allegations to rescue all his animals and end his abuse. Now, how that might have changed the documentary. Brittany talks about all that and about her testimony at Joe Exotic's trial. She was the only witness called by the defense. What did she say? Here's my conversation with the PETA attorney who had a much larger role in the Tiger King saga than the documentary led on. The PETA Foundation's Brittany Peet on the PETA Podcast. So Brittany, thank you for doing this. You're doing a lot of these now. You're an old pro.
Yeah, there's been a lot of attention to the issue of big cat cub petting, which is one of the main issues that I work on since Tiger King was released on Netflix. So we've been talking a lot about it, and thankfully, the public really seems to be mobilized behind us and supporting us in ending this industry.
Now, I have to tell you this because we've talked about this. We talked about it in the summer. We talked about it a year ago. Does it surprise you that a documentary on Joe Maldonado Passage, Joe Exotic, has really taken the world by storm? I mean, if you look at the Netflix documentary or how people have gravitated to the documentary, has it surprised you at all?
It's so hard to wrap my head around because this has been my life for the past 10 years and I lived all of this. And so, for me, as I was watching it, I was trying to think of how people outside of this world would be seeing it. And it really is a train wreck of personalities that people wouldn't normally see mixed with animal abuse and and abuse of women and taking advantage of young men. And so I guess I can see how, especially at this moment when everyone is looking for an escape from the craziness of everyday life, that it could have captured everyone's attention. But thankfully it seems to be having a positive effect too, now that people have kind of come down from the initial shock of everything that they saw in the documentary. People are really starting to pay attention to some of the issues that were more in the background of the series, including the abuse of animals at roadside zoos. And, we're really seeing people pay attention to these issues. A lot of people didn't know that tiger cub petting was happening in the United States until they saw Tiger King. And so now we have so many more people calling their federal representatives and calling for them to support the Big Cat Public Safety Act, which would prohibit the private ownership of big cats, including tigers, and prohibit the direct contact between members of the public and big cats, and would effectively end the tiger cub petting industry. So as crazy as this all has been, and as imperfect as the documentary may be, it does seem to be having a really positive effect for our efforts to close down this industry.
Now, it's still, though, it must surprise you that because this has been, like you said, this has been your life. And to see, like the last 10 years, I mean, you're fighting incrementally. Sometimes it feels like you're battling uphill. And now to see it all just kind of explode. I mean, even Saturday Night Live did a sketch with a spoof on Carol Baskin the other day.
Right.
How do you feel about your work and about what you've done? And how do you feel about how the world is attracted to these media spectacles? I mean, you must have some kind of feelings about, I mean, it's a gift on the one hand, but
Yep.
on the other hand, I know what, tell me your thoughts here.
Well, I certainly understand the train wreck quality of all of it. It's not something that we've been immune to over the years as we worked on these cases. We're constantly saying there's never a dull moment in our jobs. But at the same time, I mean, I'm so proud of the work that everyone on our team at the PETA Foundation and the legal department has done to help to end this industry. And Tiger King, it almost came out at a perfect time. Just a few days after it was released, we won our first Endangered Species Act case challenging tiger cub petting at a roadside zoo. So just a few days after Tiger King was released, we won a court order that states unequivocally that it violates the Federal Endangered Species Act to prematurely separate tiger cubs from their mothers and to use them in public encounters. And so, with the tailwind of Tiger King behind us, we have great momentum to put that first of its kind court order to work, saving tigers and putting animal abusers out of business.
Now, the suit that you're describing, this is the Dade City Wild Things case. Why does PETA have to approach this issue through litigation? And tell me the significance of the Dade City Wild Things case.
Dade City's Wild Things is a roadside zoo in Florida that did tiger cub petting for many years, and they took the abuse even further by not just doing photo ops with tiger cubs, but they would actually throw baby tigers into pools with members of the public and force them to swim for $200. And PETA did an eyewitness investigation at Dade City's Wild Things that revealed tiger cubs frantically struggling to get out of the pool, climbing up trainers to stop from being forced to swim endlessly, tiger cubs being slapped in the face, pulled by their tails to force them to continue to participate in these encounters. And for years, PETA tried to go through regulatory and law enforcement channels to help the animals. We submitted complaint after complaint to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, to the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and they were still allowed to continue to operate. And this is something that we see over and over again with these exhibitors, including with Joe Exotic. The USDA is complicit in this abuse. They have the authority to shut these places down, but they don't use it. So in certain cases, PETA has chosen to file lawsuits under the Federal Endangered Species Act, which has a citizen suit provision that allows us to sue. And we're essentially trying to create a first of its kind federal precedent, which we've now achieved in the Dade City's Wild Things case, finding that these activities violate federal law.
That's okay about your dog. He's not violating
I'm going to
any
get him a
laws
treat.
by. The fact is, the laws that exist haven't worked, and you've had to take people to court in order to get them to enforce the law.
That's right. I mean, certainly the laws as they exist now, the Animal Welfare Act, which is enforced by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, to be sure, the law and the standards are inadequate to ensure the humane treatment of animals, which is the statutory mandate of the Animal Welfare Act, and they need to be updated. But more importantly, the USDA needs to enforce the law. The law as written could be used to shut these places down, and it should be used to shut these places down. But the USDA simply is choosing not to act. Now that may have changed, or we may see some changes in the wake of Tiger King now that there's more light shown on the tiger cub petting industry in particular, and I hope that it does. But it's about a decade too late.
Why do you say that? Is a decade too late because of the number of animals that have been abused, or because we're further down the road than we should be and it's hard to scale back?
Hundreds, if not thousands, of tigers have been abused and killed and suffered horribly in the past 10 years since this industry really started and took off in earnest. And the USDA had the opportunity to stop it then. And it should have stopped it then. And because it didn't, Joe Exotic, he had more than 200 big cats on his property at times over the past decade. And he was breeding incessantly, constantly pumping out baby tigers that he could sell to roadside zoos across the country. And when I met Joe for the first time in November of 2017, and one of the first things that he told me is that, a lot of these places, once the cubs are too old to be used in cub petting, which is under 6 months, a lot of these guys, they'll just kill them. He said that some of them will hit them over the head with a hammer and kill them that way. He specifically told me that Doc Antle, who's featured in Tiger King, kills the cubs in a gas chamber that he has on his property and then burns their bodies in an on-site crematorium. And he explained to me how these exhibitors falsify their USDA paperwork because they're supposed to keep track of every animal that's in their facility, but they falsify their paperwork to make it look like these tigers never existed. And that's another way that the USDA is complicit in this abuse, because the worst that will happen to an exhibitor who falsifies USDA paperwork in this way, if a USDA inspector happens to come during the few months that this cub is at their facility, and the USDA happens to notice that there is a cub or several cubs missing from the inventory, the worst thing that happens is that the exhibitor gets what's called a citation on an inspection report, but there's no fine associated with that. There's no penalty associated with that. So it's a no-lose situation for these facilities, especially since until Joe's prosecution for killing 5 endangered tigers, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service wasn't prosecuting people for killing endangered tigers.
And of course, if they're not prosecuting and if they're not enforcing the law, then the public, they just see the tiger cub petting industry out there in full form or full force, and they just think it's normal, right?
Absolutely. And these facilities also have robust disinformation campaigns. They say that they had to take the cubs from their mothers because their mothers rejected them. Well, if their mother rejected them, then you shouldn't continue breeding the mother. And I mean, as we saw in Tiger King, they're taking these baby tigers away from their mothers, in that case, while she was still in labor. So they're not waiting to see whether or not the mother rejects the cubs or not. They're taking the cubs away. These facilities will say absolutely anything that they can to get your money.
And then, of course, Joe Exotic was a breeder. He was kind of the supplier of all these, well, not all of them, but a lot of the tiger cubs in the petting industry. As you say, they have a 6-month career and then they kill them. That's pretty much it for their lives. I mean, there's no continuing on as an adult tiger in America.
They can typically be used until they're about 4 months old. Some of the exhibitors push it a bit. And it differs. Certainly some of the cubs are killed. Some of them are sold to private owners or shipped off to other roadside zoos. And those are the tigers that we see pacing in tiny, cramped, cement-floored cages in roadside zoos across the country. And others are put to work as breeding machines themselves to continue the cycle of cruelty. And the premature separation is just as traumatic for the mothers as it is for the babies. These are cubs who would be with their mothers for 2 years. And tiger mothers are loving mothers who teach their cubs how to be tigers, and they will scream when the cubs are taken from them. But these exhibitors don't care because to them, the cubs are nothing more than currency.
It's really something that when I talked to you last in the summer, the Washington Post did a big story, and the revelation was there are more tigers in captivity in the U.S. than exist in the wild, in the world, which is hard to believe that we're tiger central, but we abuse the tigers so much. That should be a distinction of shame and not something of pride.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. And the vast majority of tigers who exist in the United States have absolutely no conservation value because every single tiger in a roadside zoo in the United States is mixed subspecies that doesn't exist in the wild. So it's typically a combination of Siberian and Bengal tiger, usually mixed significantly throughout the generations. And of course, not only can none of these tigers who are in captivity right now in the United States be released into the wild because they don't have any skills to be able to survive, but there's no wild to put them in because they're not purebred tigers who have actual conservation value. So that's another one of the misinformation campaigns that a lot of these roadside zoos put out is that, we have to make these tigers for conservation. But they're not making tigers who exist in the wild. They're making hybrid subspecies to line their own pockets.
Wow, it's strange. It's like these tigers, I don't know if it's a real species, Tiger americanus, but it's like their own little, they're kind of like a domesticated wild tiger. And they can't put them anywhere except in their little cages. I mean, you don't send them out in the wild, right?
Absolutely not. And we shouldn't be tigers in America in the first place. PETA's position is, of course, that wild animals belong in the wild. But none of these tigers in roadside zoos in the United States can be released into the wild. And so the next best thing for them is to be released into reputable sanctuaries. There are around a dozen of them across the country that provide excellent lifetime care to big cats, where the focus is on the individual big cats and their welfare rather than on profit or on making a good experience for a visitor. And Big Cat Rescue, Carol Baskin's facility, which is of course discussed at length in Tiger King, is one of those sanctuaries.
She was doing good work. But are you surprised that for all the good work that she did, that somehow she in this documentary is portrayed as a kind of kooky villainess in a way?
Well, it fits the documentary's narrative and it creates a more salacious story, but it's just not an accurate representation of who Carol is or the work that she does. She is a fierce and tireless advocate for captive, wild, and exotic cats in the United States. She's one of the most effective advocates for exotic and wild cats in the United States. And that's one of the reasons that she's been the whipping boy of the captive industry for years. She's taken unbelievable abuse online and in person, and some of that is discussed in Tiger King. I can't imagine going out to get my mail and finding my mailbox filled with snakes. But she faced that for years, and she did not give up, and she continued fighting for cats. Even when she was literally being hunted by the man that Joe paid to kill her. And then she got a temporary respite when Joe was arrested and convicted of 2 counts of murder for hire. And now with the release of Tiger King, she's being victimized all over again by people who are buying this biased, manipulated portrayal of her in a 7-hour documentary.
Well, that's one of the things that I think is sad, because I know that Carol Baskin, her work is trying to save the cats. Joe Exotic is the man who is abusing the cats. And yet in all the subsequent things that you see about the documentary, Carol Baskin is seen as just some kooky cult figure. And, it's unfortunate that, that's what people glom onto. But the work that she does and the work that other people who are trying to rescue the big cats, it's important work. And they should be heralded as the heroes.
That's absolutely right. And one of the things that wasn't covered in the documentary that's really important for people to know is that before Joe fled GW Exotic Animal Park after his falling out with Jeff Lowe, PETA worked with him to arrange for the rescues of 39 tigers, 3 bears, 2 baboons, and 2 chimpanzees, all of whom are now living in reputable sanctuaries. The big cats and bears all live at the Wild Animal Sanctuary in Colorado. The baboons, who I'm so glad that we were able to get out of that facility, because Joe was using them to breed baby baboons that he would sell as pets. But we were thankfully able to get them out and retired. And they now live at the Peaceable Primate Sanctuary in Indiana. And the 2 chimpanzees, who we all saw at the end of Tiger King, now live at the Center for Great Apes in Florida. All wonderful facilities who do great work and are taking great care of these animals who were once abused by Joe Exotic.
Tell me more about what the documentary left out, because you referred to a narrative that the documentary has where it, pits Joe Exotic as this, he's this exotic Trump-like character in a weird way. And we have Carol Baskin and we have all the cronies of Joe. And of course we have this did he or didn't he kind of mystery going on until the trial. So that's the documentary's narrative. But what was left out that you think is important? And you've met him several times. Mm-hmm. What don't we see in the documentary that's important to say?
It's really important for people to remember that Joe bred hundreds, if not thousands, of big cat cubs over the years, and he sold them indiscriminately to anyone who would pay the named price for them, including to people he knew were going to kill those cubs before they were 6 months old, including to Doc Antle, who he claims gassed the cubs before they were 6 months old, including to Tim Stark, whom he knew was going to declaw the cubs, which Joe admitted to me that he knew was cruel. He didn't care. The only thing that Joe cared about was money.
Well, that sort of comes out, no? Or do you think it should have been, a lot of the details were spared for the overall documentary of here's this Florida weirdness with Joe Exotic in the lead?
Based on the hashtag Free Joe Exotic memes that I'm seeing going around on social media, I think that that's something that people are not paying attention to. They're choosing to see him as a cult hero rather than the animal abuser that he is. He was cited for more than 200 violations of the Animal Welfare Act during the time that he was operating. A 2006 PETA undercover investigation revealed animals were being underfed. They would often not be fed for 3 days in a row. It revealed tigers being hit in the head with the butts of rifles. In one case, a lion was released into a cage with tigers, and the tigers attacked the lion and chewed her leg off. There was horrific abuse happening at this facility under the direction of Joe Exotic, and people need to remember that.
And there were 200 animal welfare violations. I mean, there were some violations. That's why he went to trial. It wasn't just the murder for hire, although that might have been the key thing that got him to court. But 200 animal welfare violations is nothing to sneeze at.
That's right, especially when you consider that the USDA chronically under-enforces the Animal Welfare Act. So, when even considering that, he had 200 Animal Welfare Act violations, it's significant. He did at one time lose his license temporarily, and was fined $25,000. Unfortunately, the USDA allowed him to continue operating after that, but there is a significant record of animal abuse.
Tell me more about the USDA, though, because when you mention USDA and Joe, it sounds like the USDA were as much the enablers of Joe Exotic than all the other cronies around him. The straight drug addicted young men that he, I don't know if he coerced them to be his lovers. I guess he's happily married from the post documentary stories. But tell me, is there something that can be done now in terms of the USDA and why they under-enforced certain things in the past?
The USDA has filed what they call enforcement actions, civil lawsuits against at least 2 facilities that engage in cub petting, including Dade City's Wild Things. And they ordered a 60-day suspension of Dade City's Wild Things license, as well as a fine. That is stayed pending appeal. Of course, all of these places are closed to the public right now, given the pandemic. And we also saw an appeal of the original order in Tim Stark's USDA civil suit, and his license was revoked. So, that is also likely to be appealed. But, those are great steps. The problem is that lawsuit against Tim Stark, the USDA lawsuit against Tim Stark, was originally filed in 2016. So we need a system that works faster, because the animals can't wait 4 years, especially these cubs who are killed in after just a few months. They don't have 4 years. Think about how many cubs would die during that time. So the USDA is apparently preparing to publish new regulations relating to licensing that will allow the USDA to more easily revoke and suspend licenses. We'll see how that goes, but ultimately the USDA needs to vigorously enforce the Animal Welfare Act. In recent years, they've changed their language. Instead of referring to exhibitors such as Tim Stark, Jeff Lowe, and Joe Exotic as licensees, they refer to them as customers. When their statutory mandate is to ensure the humane treatment of animals, not to enable cruel businesses to continue operating. And that's been their MO for the past few years. And so I hope that with the increased attention on these activities following Tiger King, that USDA will start to take their jurisdiction over animal welfare more seriously.
Do you think they're being embarrassed to act? Do you think this is acted as an expose of sorts, even though it's really more a personal tale of Joe Exotic? Do you think it, or do you think that people are saying, I don't care about the tigers, I just care about Joe, free Joe?
I do think that. I mean, I certainly think that the USDA should be embarrassed because all of this activity falls squarely within their jurisdiction, and they've done nothing about it. And the documentary makes that clear. And even in TMZ did their own follow-up show on Tiger King that aired on Fox, and you saw both Doc Antle and Jeff Lowe hiding behind their own animal welfare records. Both of them have significant histories of USDA citations, but they lie and claim that they don't have any violations, and they're trying to make a distinction between the write-ups that occur on those inspection reports and the types of lawsuits that were filed against Dade City's Wild Things and Tim Stark, claiming that those are the only way that you can get a USDA Animal Welfare Act violation. So the USDA is complicit in all of this. These exhibitors are continuing to hide behind the USDA's lack of enforcement in their effort to dupe members of the public into continuing to support them. And it's long past time for the USDA to step up.
Now, you mentioned a second ago, Doc Antle and Tim Stark. Let's take them one at a time. What about Doc Antle and what wasn't in the documentary? And, we saw one of his former employees who shares disturbing information about how he allegedly coerces his young female employees to work 7 days a week. There's a lot of sordid stuff there. What is Doc Antle really like?
Sure. Well, Doc Antle is one of the most prolific abusers of tiger cubs and other animals in the country. He virtually constantly has tiger cubs or other big cat cubs that he's using for encounters at his Myrtle Beach roadside zoo. He also uses chimpanzees for encounters with the public and other publicity stunts. He claims, including on the TMZ special, that every cub that he uses in these encounters stays at his facilities for life. Well, PETA has recently publicized uncontrovertible evidence. There's documentation showing that just last summer, Doc Antle transferred 2 tiger cubs who'd outgrown cub petting to a circus abuser in Wisconsin at an outfit called Circus World. So he's a liar just like the rest of them, but he has more money.
And that's what it's all about, right? They make their money through the big cats, and they're going to do it as long as it can make money.
Absolutely.
How about Tim Stark? What is he about?
Tim Stark is one of the most brutal animal abusers in the United States, and the documentary really didn't tell viewers much about him, but PETA has gotten to know him very well over the past several years that we've been filing regulatory complaints and ultimately suing him under the Endangered Species Act as well. Tim Stark gleefully admits to beating a leopard cub to death with a baseball bat. In some filings, he's claimed beating other animals to death with a baseball bat. He admitted under oath in his deposition in PETA's Endangered Species Act lawsuit that you must use physical punishment to put these animals in their places in order to use them in cub petting and to be able to interact with them throughout their lives. And this is all in USDA records, he would, back when he was able to do big cat cub petting, he would advise members of the public during cub petting to smack cubs in the face if they nipped at them or got too rambunctious, which of course is what cubs are supposed to do. That's very natural for them. They should be playing and play biting with their siblings and with their mother. After the USDA forced him to stop that, he outfitted all of his volunteers with riding crops and had them smack the cubs in the face with riding crops during cub petting. Another thing that people don't necessarily realize about the cruelty of cub petting is that tiger cubs should be sleeping for 18 hours a day. But at these cub petting facilities, they're forced to work hour after hour. And so what we've seen and what has been documented in Tim Stark's USDA inspection reports in particular are cubs who are so exhausted from having to work full days at these facilities that they literally have to be dragged by their legs back into the tiger cub petting ring to force them to continue to interact with the public, all to make money for exhibitors like Tim Stark.
So basically, the tiger cubs, if they're docile, it's because they're darn tired.
It's because they're tired. In some cases, they may be drugged, and also because they're physically abused. Yeah, all of the above.
Well, what's going to happen, or what's it going to take to bring people like Doc Antle and Tim Stark? What's it going to take to send them down the same path as Joe Exotic, where they spend some time behind bars?
Well, the USDA and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service need to step up and take on the abuse and exploitation of tiger cubs in this cruel industry. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service needs to start taking the trafficking of captive tigers in the United States seriously and take on the whole trafficking ring, not just Joe. And they need to start prosecuting the abuse of tigers under the Endangered Species Act, which they can do, and which they did in Joe's case by prosecuting him for shooting 5 tigers in the head to make room for tigers that he was being paid to board from the circus. The most important thing that every person can do to take on this industry is to simply never interact with a wild or exotic animal, and to never, ever buy a ticket to a roadside zoo. That's the easiest way that we can shut down this industry. And the other thing that everyone needs to do is to get on the phone and call your federal representatives and senators and ask them to support the Big Cat Public Safety Act. If we can get that law passed, we can stop this industry in its tracks and ensure the welfare of captive tigers in the United States. And we can really make sure that we get all of these animals to reputable sanctuaries and stop this business for good.
So in many ways, Tiger King has moved the issue forward, or do you think it's because there are people who think Joe Exotic is a hero, and we still haven't, we still don't know if Doc Antle or Tim Stark are going to, pay the same kind of price as Joe Exotic. Where are you now, you think? How has Tiger King impacted your work?
Well, it's too early to say what impact Tiger King will have. In terms of my own work, it started a lot of conversations that we weren't having before, and it's opened a lot of people's eyes to what's really going on at these roadside zoos across the country. But PETA has been fighting this industry for years. We're making tremendous strides. As I previously said, we just won our first lawsuit challenging this industry. Our second lawsuit, in which we're suing Tim Stark and Jeff Lowe, is going very well, and we're very optimistic about that lawsuit as well. And so no matter what happens with Tiger King, PETA is always going to continue fighting for the animals, and we will win.
Brittany, I just have a few more questions. It's so interesting to talk to you, since you had more than a cameo in the documentary. What was it like to see yourself in the documentary?
It was interesting. It was a little bit surreal, especially given how big the documentary has gotten. But I'm really glad that PETA was represented in the documentary. And even though we would have liked to have seen more about the animals and the impact on the animals,
There's an animal.
I'm glad that that's right. Yes, my dog Leonard has very strong feelings about this too. I'm glad that we at least had a seat at the table and were able, and that PETA's voice was heard in this documentary.
Tell me about, once again, about the work of people like Carol Baskin, the people who, PETA does its job, and litigators like you are fighting in the courts, but there are people, real activists like Carol Baskin, but she's being somewhat maligned in the culture after the documentary. How do you think the work of people like Carol Baskin and other people who are really out there trying to save the big cats, how do you think they're going to be affected?
Well, I hope that people will pay more attention to what they're doing, to learn more about these sanctuaries that are advocating for captive big cats in the United States and that are providing lifelong homes for abused and neglected big cats in the United States. I hope that more people will learn about their missions. I hope that people will think critically when they watch Tiger King and not just take what they see in the documentary as gospel. I have been to big cat rescue myself multiple times, and I can say unequivocally that their enclosures were vastly misrepresented. What you were shown in the documentary are small little cubbies where the animals go to eat and drink. When in reality, their enclosures are spacious. They have natural terrain, wonderful enrichment. I've never seen a single animal pacing at big cat rescue. They're all engaging in natural big cat behaviors and thriving under big cat rescue's care.
But would you say, a lot of people who I talked to who just saw the documentary would say, oh, she's a cult leader, she's kind of kooky. Is that a fair representation of Carol Baskin?
Well, she certainly isn't a cult leader. She's the head of a very effective nonprofit organization that does advocacy as well as animal rescue. Being kooky doesn't make you a criminal. And Carol should be judged by the quality of her work and her character. And having worked with Carol for many, many years, her character is unimpeachable, as is her wonderful advocacy work and rescue work for wild and exotic cats in the United States.
I think it's important to say as many nice things about Carol Baskin, just because I think she is, doesn't come across as well in the documentary for whatever reason. People are taking away different things, but that is a record that needs to be straightened. And I'm glad you did here. Let me ask you this other question. What other kinds of animals besides tigers are exploited in these roadside zoos? Since a lot of people's eyes are open to roadside zoos now, what other kind of animals the public needs to be concerned about?
Well, I'll just give two examples since there are so many. Another big source of cruelty at roadside zoos across the country are bears. Bear cubs are also used in petting encounters. Bears also stay with their mothers in the wild for around 2 years, and they, just as tiger cubs do, they cry when they're taken from their mothers. We also often see in bear cubs in particular, because they're taken from their mothers before the natural weaning period, they develop stereotypical suckling behaviors where they will obsessively suckle on their body parts or body parts of other animals that they're confined with. And in some cases, if they aren't able to be transferred to appropriate facilities, they'll have these behaviors for life. And they aren't just behaviors that happen. They're reflective of extreme psychological distress. These animals have lost their minds. And adult bears in roadside zoos are typically held in tiny, often concrete floored enclosures. These are animals who have natural habitats in the wild of hundreds of miles, where they spend most of their days roaming and foraging for food. They're naturally extremely active animals, but in roadside zoos, they can often only take a few steps in either direction. So we often see bears in roadside zoos who are extremely obese. We rescued a bear named Dylan in January who is more than 500 pounds overweight.
Ooh.
He's around 3 times the size of, he's an Asiatic black bear, and he's around 3 times the size that he should be. Thankfully, he's at the Wild Animal Sanctuary now and recovering. The other category of animals that people should think about and pay a lot of attention to are primates. We see a lot of primates at roadside zoos, especially lemurs, which like tigers are an endangered species. And virtually all primate species are incredibly social. And just like with humans, and a lot of us are experiencing this now when we can't see our friends and our families, it's incredibly cruel to confine primates in solitary confinement. But we regularly see that at roadside zoos. And the way that distress manifests in primates is similar to that we see in other species like tigers and bears. But they also often will self-mutilate. We'll see them biting their bodies, pulling out their own hair, pacing, biting at their cage bars. So whenever you see that sort of behavior at a roadside zoo, it's a great sign that animals are not thriving in those environments. And it's important to, certainly you should never, ever go to a roadside zoo. But if you ever find yourself at one of these facilities, ask questions. Ask why the lemur is by themselves. Ask why the tiger is pacing. And as PETA always says, never, ever be silent.
Is there a Joe Exotic for bears that we can expose?
Well, one of the worst facilities for bears in the country is Oswald's Bear Ranch, which is located in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. It opens at Memorial Day every year, and it exploits bear cubs for photo ops every single year. And so PETA has been trying to put a stop to that cruelty for years. Another facility that we're putting a lot of focus on right now is also in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, like Doc Antle, and it's called Wakatee Zoo. They have primates who, as I just described, will frantically pace back and forth in their cages. They scratch and bite at their own bodies. They have a tiger named Lila who is almost completely bald, and we're really trying with the increased focus on captive tigers in the United States right now to try to capitalize on that attention to get Lila transferred to an accredited sanctuary. She desperately needs veterinary care, and so we're really trying to get her out so that she can get better.
So all these animals everywhere need to be rescued, and PETA did rescue. You did rescue some animals from Joe Exotic's facility. Tell me, what kind of animals are we talking about, and how did you get them, and where are they now?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about the animals that were rescued from Joe's facility. The first 19 that we rescued were 19 tigers who were actually transferred to Joe by Dade City's Wild Things, the Florida roadside zoo that PETA sued under the Endangered Species Act over their own tiger cub petting operation. And that all came about because Dade City's Wild Things thought that they could evade a court-ordered PETA site inspection, which was part of the litigation, they thought, well, if there are no tigers, then PETA can't come in and inspect. Well, they were wrong. But nonetheless, they violated 2 federal court orders by sending 19 tigers across the country in a metal cattle trailer in the heat of the summer. There were no water receptacles in the trailer. At least one of the tigers was pregnant, and she gave birth during the trip, and all 3 of her cubs died. So after that happened, because Dade City's Wild Things violated this federal court order, we also had the opportunity to add Joe as an accomplice to that contempt of court, and he decided that he would rather that we just take the tigers. So we were able to transfer those first 19 tigers in November of 2017, and that's when I first met Joe. And at that time, his husband, Travis, had just died. He was really being pushed into a corner by Carol's collection of his judgment. She was very effectively working to cut him off at the knees through collecting her judgment. And at the same time, he no longer owned the zoo. Jeff Lowe owned the zoo, and they were falling out. And so he was backed into a corner and was looking for a way out. And I think that he saw PETA as a potential lifeline. And so we started a correspondence, and we were working to come up with an agreement that would close the roadside zoo down for good and get him and Jeff Lowe out of the industry for good. But ultimately, Jeff Lowe wouldn't play ball. So what we were able to do was at least work with Joe to get more animals out of that facility and into reputable sanctuaries. So we were ultimately able to get 20 more tigers, 3 bears, 2 baboons, and those 2 chimpanzees that you see at the end of Tiger King out of Joe's roadside zoo. And, the animals all suffered various degrees of, all of them suffered psychological abuse, but a large number of them also had literal physical scars from their time at Joe's facility. A lot of them had skin conditions. They were lame, and they required significant rehabilitation that they've thankfully now received at these sanctuaries. So PETA has now, including these animals, rescued 72 bears, 49 tigers, 1 lion, 10 chimpanzees, and 2 baboons over the past few years from roadside zoos.
Wow. It's really something. If PETA had made that agreement with Joe Exotic and Jeff Lowe, there may not have been an attempt at a hit against Carol Baskin.
Well, we just don't know. During the time that I was talking to Joe about all of this was during the time that, according to the court testimony, and his conviction, he was at that same time arranging for the hit on Carol.
But, we've talked about this in the past. You were the only person called by Joe Exotic's defense to testify on his behalf.
That's right. And it really shows how weak his case was, that a PETA lawyer who'd been fighting to close him down for a decade was, other than himself, the only witness for the defense.
And now we've come full circle from talking about the documentary and roadside zoos and what's not in the documentary. Brittany, is there anything, you've been called to do interviews by a number of people all throughout the world. Is there one thing that hasn't come out in any interview that you want to share with me, just me right now on the PETA podcast?
Oh gosh, I wish I could think of something, but I've done so many interviews that I don't that I don't think that I can. Actually, one thing, and this has come out a bit. I just think that I want people to be cognizant of the abuse of animals in the film and television industry as well. That is an aspect of this industry that doesn't get as much attention, and it didn't in the documentary either. But PETA has done eyewitness investigations of this industry as well, including of tigers used in the film and television industry. And we found that one of the major suppliers for film and television, who's based in Canada and who provided one of the tigers for the movie Life of Pi, eyewitness video footage from that investigation showed the owner of the facility, Michael Hackenberger, brutally whipping a tiger 19 times. It was so brutal that she rolled onto her back in a submission position and expressed her anal glands, which is a fear response. And that punishment was all because she missed a jump. She was a tiger who was going to be used apparently for circus performances. And this is what goes on behind the scenes. You may see that the American Humane Association phrase at the end of movies saying that no animals were harmed during the making of this process. And, we certainly know that that is an imperfect process too. But where most of the cruelty to these animals happens is behind the scenes. They're beaten behind the scenes, and then the trainers will hold a rod or some other implement so that the animal has a constant reminder that if they're even 1 second out of time or one step out of place, then they could be beaten just like they are behind the scenes.
So the whole thing about the roadside zoo is just one aspect. There's this other aspect in entertainment. I know that PETA is, trying to fight that and end that in other areas. But one last thing on the documentary, and once again, I mentioned you were called by the defense to testify on Joe's behalf. Did he ever talk to you beforehand, before the trial, and try to, butter you up or say, hey, look, you remember I'm a good guy. Remember, did he ever say anything like that personally to you? Hey, come on, Brittany. I remember 2017, I saved those baboons. You didn't want to save the bears. I got you the bears. Did he ever try to negotiate like that to say, come on, remember, I'm a good guy?
No, his lawyers smartly wouldn't allow him to communicate with me before the trial.
What would you have said if he said, if you had the chance?
Well, my obligation is to the animals. It's not to Joe or to anyone else. My obligation is to the animals, but in court, especially as an attorney myself, and as an officer of the court, my duty in court is to tell the truth, and that's all I ever would have done.
So when you did testify on Joe's behalf, though, right?
I don't know that I would frame it that way. I testified for the defense. I wouldn't say that I testified on Joe's behalf. I was subpoenaed. I didn't have a choice.
Yeah.
I was compelled to appear there.
And when you told the truth, what did you say about Joe's case?
Well, I told the truth, but I framed it in the light most favorable to the animals, because it's my job to tell the animals' stories. And so, for example, when the first question that Joe's defense attorney asked was, how did you first come to meet Joe? And I answered by telling him the story of the 19 Dade City's Wild Things tigers who suffered on that stifling ride across the country, and those 3 tiger cubs who died on that trip. And so I did my best to try to tell the animals' stories in the context of the questions that I was asked.
Is there one moment that you felt that you were really delivering the message for the animals, that you felt that even though you're speaking, you're testifying for the defense? Was there that one moment that you don't forget?
I think it's telling the story of those 19 Dade City's Wild Things tigers. I can't imagine how horrific that long trip must have been in, the cattle trailer that would have been hot itself, and just magnifying all of that heat, and to have no water to drink for hour after hour after hour. In one of the Joe did a live broadcast of the, sorry, my dog
That's
has
okay.
feelings about this too, apparently.
Yeah.
Joe did a live broadcast of the tigers arriving at his facility, and one of the tigers, a juvenile white tiger, the video showed that he was so thirsty that he started drinking from a mud puddle. The clip was about 5 minutes long, and the cub drank the entire time, still drinking when the video feed cut off. That's just how desperately thirsty this cat was. And so it was really important for me to tell that story, and it continues to be. And I'm so glad that cat and every other cat from Dade City's Wild Things has now been rescued. The remaining 6 tigers from Dade City's Wild Things were just rescued a couple of weeks ago, and arrived at the Wild Animal Sanctuary in early April.
And that little bit of testimony people didn't see on
Right.
Tiger King.
That's right.
But they heard it here on the PETA Podcast. Thank you, Brittany.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Brittany Peet, head of CALE, the Captured Animal Law Enforcement Division at the PETA Foundation, with the truth behind the Tiger King. It kind of gets lost sometimes, because you look at all the memes that say, free Joe Exotic. Can you really say that if you knew the truth? And poor Carol Baskin, made fun of in Saturday Night Live, in that bit they did the other day. So we thank Brittany again for appearing on the PETA Podcast. And if you want more information, go to PETA.org. And that's our program. Hey, you can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or on aldef.org/blog, or amok.com, my personal website. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music provided by CarbonWorks. Check them out on YouTube. Join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.